I think I'd like to start talking about writing by telling you how I got started, because it's pretty interesting. It was 36 years ago, and I don't think anybody could do that today. But I was alone with 4 little children. My husband was a military man in the Arctic for a whole year, and when he left, the youngest child was 3 weeks old. So none of the children could take care of each other. It was a very cold winter, and if I needed a quart of milk or an onion, I had to snowsuit up all 4 of these little kids, take them to the store. And after he left in October, and in about the 1st of February, I said, "What are you going to do to keep from going crazy?" And since I was all alone, I said, "I guess I'll be a writer." So I went down in the basement, uncovered this old typewriter, and wrote a story, an experience just like what was happening to me. And I tried to make it humorous, because otherwise it would just be a tragedy. And I called it The Education of a Cold War Widow, because the Cold War was on. And I dropped it in the mail to a magazine called Air Force, and they accepted it. And I am the only person that I have ever ran into who got published on the very first thing she ever wrote. And it changed. I thought, gee, the reason other people aren't doing it is because I'm the first person who ever thought of this. So I just kept writing. This first story was reprinted in the Magazine of the Midlands, which is the Omaha World Herald's magazine section. And so then when it ran on that Sunday, that very same week, Sun newspapers in Lincoln was starting publication. And the editor, who was Jeff Withrow, called me and asked me if I would like to be a stringer for the new weekly. And I said, "What's a stringer?" And he says, "Well, a stringer is a person who gathers the neighborhood news and just writes it up for us. You know what it is, like so-and-so went to chicken dinner." Yeah. Well, in any case, I said, why would I want to be a stringer when I'm already a writer? And when we got to be friends, he used to kid me about that, because he thought it was very egotistical. And so then he said, "What would you like to write for us?" And I said, I could write a column. And he said, "Okay, your first deadline is tomorrow." And I put down the phone and ran to the dictionary to see if I could learn from the dictionary what a column was. Well, I wrote that column for the Sun from Thanksgiving Day 1961 until 1967, when it won a national first place award. And that information moved on the Associated Press wire, and Joe Sechrist, managing editor of the Lincoln Journal, didn't know who I was, but he asked around the plant, who is this woman? And so Gil Savory knew who I was, and Mr. Sechrist said, "Go out and hire her." So I came to work in the newspaper without knowing a thing about journalism, but I knew how to write. Well, in this weekly column that I wrote for 17 years, I had this mythical woman in Beaver Crossing, Nebraska, who was about 35, and she had 2 little children, the youngest of whom had a chronic cold. And so I just wrote her this letter every week, and I wanted to give her some information. I wanted to teach her something, and I wanted to give her a smile. And in the doing of that, I was very fortunate. I think I had a lot of readers. People who know me really well know that when the days start getting shorter, I have trouble with that. And so as I look back at what I wrote a lot about the weather, even when I was writing a column. And then the other thing I wrote a lot about was the first snowfall. It took me a long time to figure out what I was going to read, because every time I found something suitable, or what I thought was suitable, it reminded me of something else, or what happened when I happened to write this. And so it's been a real chase down memory lane. But from the age of this group, I would say that most of you knew me as a columnist. And so, first of all, I'm going to read an old column. It's probably 25 years old, and it's about October. Happiness is coming home from work after sidelining a football game, wet and cold, hungry and tired, and finding a mug of yellow daisies at your door. If you've ever wondered if human beings can make the sun come up, they can. Happiness is kidding around in print that you may need a blood transfusion and having 12 donors queue up. It's a note from your daughter saying, "You must fall asleep with a smile on your face every night." Not quite, almost. Happiness is Dad raking up acorns because the squirrels who live in his oaks don't seem to be storing any this year. He swears they are Democrats and have been raised to wait for a handout. Happiness is trying to decide if you really ought to go to the Halloween bash as the Jolly Green Giant or act your age and go as Tinker Bell. Happiness is eating lunch in the NU press box with photographer Harold Dramanis, who entertains by reciting press box menus from around the Big 8 circuits and assures you that the barbecued beef you're eating is the best there is. Happiness is living in a group situation that is a microcosm of ideas, diversity, human texture, and interest. It's the knowledge that life has an ebb and flow, that it is a process and any stopping off place is only an artificial barrier, that it is a daily gift of new options. Happiness is a faith that keeps wonder and surprise springing into the soul, a faith that permits the observance of the divine in the eyes of the betrayed as well as in the eyes of the joyful. In April, you can wing it with one good creed and a few well-versed theories. In October, you need a faith that will not only fly, but will provide you with wings. Happiness, the last week of October, is about expected spooks and witchy surprises. It is about hot cider and mulled wine. It is about homemade bread and hot chocolate. It is about astroturf and pigskins. It is about the security of snow tires and antifreeze and warm mittens and a general battening down of the hatches. October happiness is found around fireplaces and under electric blankets. It's the breathtaking panorama of changing leaves through freshly washed windows. It's honeyed tea and a dorm room chat with someone who thinks she's in love. Happiness any time of the year is the self-assurance of knowing who you are and what you can be counted upon to do. And I do love snow, the first snowfall. As I look back through stuff, I've written a lot about snow. It seems abnormal to me to love something for a long time and not become intimate. It happened to me Sunday, and I'm a better woman for it. I have loved snow for as long as I can remember. One of my first memories is of my dad beaming about what a tough little Trojan I was for always trudging along at his heels. I think I figured out early that if anyone was going to get into snow, it would be Dad. And while he thought I was grooving on him, it was really the snow that was turning me on. A heavy snowfall is a mystical thing that energizes the bejeebers out of me and speaks of something native in my blood, whatever that means. Sunday was a day to remember. Our neighborhood cemetery, which can be gray, dreary, and God-forsaken, turned into a fairyland. The ugly conglomeration of tombstones became puffy marshmallows and giant mushrooms, and one could easily believe there are things much worse than being dead and being bedded down under a fluffy eiderdown. The elms that make a shady arch over our street in the summertime were even prettier as they touched their black bony limbs together, like a child making a church steeple with his fingers, and all frosted with 6 inches of whipped cream. Chili is snowy day cookery, and I shipped the fudge out immediately after I cooked it, as fudge is about the last thing in the world I need. I watched the snow fall for hours. I walked in it, tasted it, wallered in it, but that was not enough. I knew I had to deepen my relationship with it. I don't know now if it was something I said or if she only read my mind. But suddenly one of my daughters said, "Go ahead, Mom, do it." So I slipped out of my slippers and walked around barefoot in that sea of cool cotton. It may seem insane, but if you haven't tried it, don't knock it. Snow is not nearly so cold as you would expect, and the texture is so crunchy and interesting that it's hard to keep your mind on the cold of it. Anyway, I did it, and am glad, or was. Monday, when I came home from work, the phone was ringing, and a female voice said, "Mrs. Stevens, I don't want you to think I'm a busybody, but I know you would want to know that your junior high girl took off her shoes and socks and walked around barefoot in the snow." I said the only thing any decent mother would say, "What's this world coming to, anyway?" I left the Journal Star 3.5 years ago, and a friend of mine back in Durango called my attention to the fact that I should be looking for work that required research, because he noticed in me when I worked there that I liked really digging into a story. So right after that, the Journal Star called me and told me they wanted to do a book about Nebraska's weather, and would I write it. And I had a terrible time getting started with that, because there was not much structure about what I was to write, and you could write about Nebraska's weather forever and ever. So I finally got it down to something manageable, and it has been not only a successful publishing venture, but it has been tons of fun for me, because I'll bet I have spoken about that book probably 50 times. And as I do, I gather the weather stories of people in the audience. So it's really been a nice exchange. Then the fair was going to be 125 years old, and the Journal asked me to do that book. I don't really live on the plains. The plains lives in me. And if you're a plains person, you're just different. I'm convinced after I wrote that weather book that we're tougher and we're resilient. And several major weather systems, like the blizzard of 1888, the drought of 1894, they cut the population of the state way down because people couldn't handle it. As a consequence, we are the descendants of the very tough people who stayed. When the Heritage Room contacted me, Vicki Clark encouraged me to read something I had never published. So it's a sort of article. I call it The Ones That Got Away. And it's 3 stories that I was in pursuit of, and for some reason, I didn't get to complete those stories. And it's very frustrating to me. But it makes a nice piece, I think. I'm having a real hard time with retirement, because there are no people in the world like newspaper people, and I miss them terribly. And there is no activity in the world like being a general assignment reporter, and I miss that terribly, although I don't think I could do it anymore. It's very, very hard work, but I still miss it. I wrote this maybe this year, I can't remember. I wrote it long enough ago so that it's been sent out and rejected several times. It's called The Ones That Got Away, and I think it will tell you something about my writing life. I do stories, made a career of it. General assignment reporting for newspapers affords the surest bet of staying on the story trail that I know of. Over a working lifetime, I covered the takeover of Wounded Knee, South Dakota by the American Indian Movement in the spring of 1973, and returned for the 100th anniversary of the massacre there in 1989. I watched a baby be born, covered the trial of a mother who abandoned her newborn in a grocery bag alongside a dirt road, other courtroom anguish, rode a mule to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, rode in all manner of aircraft, including a lighter-than-air balloon, went on a cattle drive, watched a family from German extraction stomp shredded cabbage into kraut with their feet. You get the idea. The person who first put those 4 memorable words, "been there, done that," on a t-shirt may have had me in mind. I'm retired now, and as the cobwebs creep slowly over my keyboard, I find the memory of these experiences does not sustain me as I thought they would. More and more, my mind turns to the ones that got away. I think of Sam, the back shop man who typeset the pages I laid out. It was before technology stripped work of its human quality. And while we collaborated on these pages, Sam and I talked about all kinds of stuff. Where we like to eat, how you reduce the itch of chicken pox, who gives the best lube job. Over the course of some months, I learned that he got up at 5 a.m. each morning so that he could attend Mass at 6 a.m. You'd have to experience a January morning in Nebraska when it is still dark, snow swirling, wind chill at -27, to understand that price. A real commitment for a man in his 70s, I decided. But when Sam's chit-chat became a story was when he revealed, sort of piecemeal, that the priest who served the Eucharist each morning was Sam's son, whom he now called Father. If the poignancy of that mix doesn't excite you, read no further. That's a story. I tried not to scare Sam off by acting out the excitement that was rushing around inside me. So real casual like I said, "Sam, when can I go to Mass with you? I want to tell your story, interview your son, learn what it means to each of you. Our readers will love it." Sam shook his head, taking a bead on my eyes with his own watery gray ones. He said pleasantly but firmly, "Keep your typewriter out of my sacred." And I honored that. I don't expect Sam is alive anymore, and I have no idea what happened to his son, the father. But I still see in my mind the photo I had envisioned of Sam kneeling, tipping his head up to receive the elements of Holy Communion from the priestly hand of his child, with candlelight outlining his silhouette. And I wonder if I should have been more persistent, more convincing, more of a pest. And I'll wonder as long as memory serves me. When I worked in the Southwest, I frequented a trading post in a small Colorado town. It stocked boots, hats, fabric linens, coffee pots, diapers, and a few sewing supplies. I learned that it was called the trading post because that's where it had its beginning. The grandparents of the current owner used to barter with the Jicarilla Apaches. Most tribes have an artistic attribute that supersedes other tribes. One day I asked about the large, dusty, and very beautiful baskets, dozens of them, that lined the top shelves all around the ceiling. Baskets were what the Jicarilla Apaches excelled at. Well, that was what was traded here in the early days, the owner said. My blood started swooshing around. "You mean," I asked incredulously, "that these are original Apache baskets from years ago?" "Many, many years ago," the owner said. "What did the Apaches trade them for?" "I don't know," he said. "Who does know?" "My grandmother." "Where is she?" "She winters in Arizona, but she'll be back on April 15th. "You can talk to her then." I made a note on my desk calendar, gave grandmother a day to settle in after her return, and called the trading post to make sure that she was ready for an interview. "Oh," the owner said, "didn't you know? She died last month." She died last month? And with her went the tales of an era that cannot be reconstructed. When the Apaches rode in, or did they walk, with their baskets to trade, did they take beads and buttons in exchange, metal cooking pots, calico and ribbon? Were they wearing buckskins? Did they have their hair plaited? Did they come in families or singly? How far did they travel? What language was spoken during bartering times? I haven't seen those beautiful baskets for a dozen years. I expect by this time some bounty hunter has offered the trading post owner a price he couldn't pass up. Or maybe with luck they ended up in a museum somewhere. But without their stories, they are only superbly woven willow branches. I do not weave baskets. Words are my game. And my heart has a small seizure every time I think of that story that time and death robbed me of. John had risen to a high place in the hierarchical order of his Protestant denomination. He seemed to me like a genuine person who did not flinch at our growing friendship in spite of the fact that I was newly divorced in an era when not everyone was. While all clerics that I had known seemed much more comfortable in the presence of their own ecclesiastical kind, John seemed perfectly at ease with sinners, and in fact seemed not to differentiate between the two. I called his attention to how unusual all that was, and he, the master of the understatement, reckoned it was mostly because of what he learned from Lily. Then he sketched out the briefest tale of having been a missionary in the Philippine Islands before World War II, where he was taken prisoner by the Japanese after the war began. Lily was a prisoner in the same compound, and with almost more emotion than John could manage, on the day he was to be executed, he said something to the effect that Lily had traded her body for his life. After the war and their releases, John was assigned by his denomination to a church in the same large city that Lily called home. He found her number in the telephone book, called and told Lily he would like to see her because he owed her so very much. Everything, really. Lily nixed the idea. She said she'd seen in the paper that John was back to work at his normal profession, and she was back working at hers. I didn't press for more information because it had been difficult for John to tell me as much as he had. Besides, there was all the time in the world to get this memorable story. I let many years pass. John became an old man, and I became retired. I still had his address and wrote to him saying that one of the tasks of aging was to make sure our stories get told. I would come to where he now lives for that purpose, I wrote. He wrote a friendly letter in response without ever mentioning my request. A gentleman's method of saying, "Keep your typewriter out of my sacred." I had it all planned. After I got John's story, I would do whatever was necessary to find Lily, see how she ended up. If she was no longer alive, see who remembered her. Visit her grave. God, what a story. But you know everything I know, and anyone can see that it's just the barest of skeletons. There are some stories that are better off left untold, that have earned the right to go to the grave with those who lived them. But not this one. Not this one. In this day and age, most reporters are specialists. And I was never a specialist. I was always a general assignment reporter. But if I came close to a specialty, it was Native American interests. So I'm going to claim that as my specialty because not everybody has written about that. And I'm going to read an old column from 1973 when I was the takeover at Wounded Knee. One of the reasons I became familiar with Native American issues was in 1971, the managing editor of the Journal asked me if I knew what the American Indian movement was. And I said, well, it's a radical group that organized in Minneapolis. And he says, you just drew the short straw. There's an American Indian movement organizer in Lincoln, and I'm going to assign you to interview him. Well, once I did that, I became the Indian reporter. And so then, when the American Indian movement took over Wounded Knee, I insisted that I go there as a reporter. And after I got back from there, I wrote a column about Wounded Knee. I'm going to read you 4 experiences I have had. Well, they're stories, but they will tell you about experiences I have had with Native Americans. And I chose them because I think not every white woman in the world has had these experiences. And I wrote this column. Wounded Knee is no place for a lady, but it's the greatest place in the world for newspapering. There must be 1,000 stories there that haven't been tapped yet. Since we last met, I have been in a snowstorm that was much like being inside a flour sifter. I slid off the road in an area where there were no tow trucks. A 2-ton gasoline truck broke 3 log chains before it managed to pull me out. Bill Kovac, correspondent for the New York Times, took me into Wounded Knee from the Pine Ridge. We agreed to meet in 45 minutes. When I went to look for him, he had left me stranded there. The Indians were frisking all incomers that day. When my guard realized I was female, well, he couldn't decide what to do with his hands, and I couldn't think what to do to keep from cracking up. I bit the inside of my lip, and after weighing his options, he decided I probably did not need to be frisked after all. I caught a ride out of Wounded Knee with a Russian correspondent writing for a news magazine in Moscow. Although he could barely speak English, he did manage to convey the idea that he thought it was very funny that I was writing out of a red nation with a real red. The next day, 2 memorable things happened. When I reached the Indian roadblock, I was marched into Wounded Knee with a shotgun in my back. When I described the incident later to my co-workers in the newsroom, they roared. The gun had been a .410. A .410, they shrieked. That wouldn't even scratch a tough old hen like you. Any one of the 33 people registered with the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time I was there would have given anything to have been able to find the priest whose church had been burned in the beginning. He reportedly had disappeared somewhere in the outer reaches of the reservation. As I was leaving Wounded Knee, a figure in a blue parka walked across the snowy field and asked if I would give him a ride to Pine Ridge. When we exchanged names, I nearly drove off the road. My passenger was none other than Father Paul Manhart. He had come into Wounded Knee to recover an ancient Sioux manuscript. When the priests first arrived, they wrote down the stories the Indians told. Then, when they were later able to read the story back, Indians caught the significance of being literate, and teaching them to read was a cinch. The manuscript Father Manhart had was written with a quill on parchment and laced together with leather thongs. On the trip into Pine Ridge, he read aloud to me the legend of the falling star. There are moments that will not die. When I applied for a reporting job at the Durango Herald, I certainly don't have the qualifications of most journalists, but the reason they picked me out of these 100 or so applicants was because I had had experience with Native Americans, and the Southern Utes and the Ute Mountain Utes were on my beat in southwest Colorado. And then as the Southern Utes became confident that I was not going to violate their privacy, they started inviting me to more and more things. And one day, they invited me into the sweat lodge, which is a rite of purification. And I did that and wrote about it. That has not been published. And then I did an all-night peyote rite in the Native American church. Those things happened in the early 80s. And then as recently as last summer, when the Northern and Southern Poncas reunited after 117 years, the Journal called me back into service and sent me to Niobrara to get that story. And while I was up there, I wrote a piece for Nebraska Public Radio, and I'm going to read that. And so those 4 Native American pieces cover 21 years. This story was published in the Durango Herald on the front page on July 14th, 1980. And the date line is Ignacio, which is the tribal headquarters of the Southern Ute tribe. With the sound of his bone flute, Southern Ute tribal chairman Leonard Birch, accompanied by the drums, seemed to call the sun up from under its mauve coverlet this morning. And when it rose, it was greeted with more flutes from the 17 persons participating in the Sundance, as well as the silent faces of observers and those who had come for a blessing. The annual Sundance ceremony is the most important spiritual ceremony in the Ute tradition. It began after dark Friday night. The sounds of those same flutes, signaling participants to the corral constructed of boughs, were almost lost in the sound of croaking frogs and the distant laughter of children. Families had taken residence around the edge of the Sundance grounds in teepees and shaded lodges to support the participants. Since that time Friday night, participants have abstained from both food and drink in a quest for spiritual power, purification, and contact with a higher power. Since that time, this reporter has had 7 meals and 168 ounces of fluid. The time has been filled with prayers and singing, with ritual and dancing. It will conclude this afternoon. The outward and visible signs of a Sundance include heat and dust, the smell of sage and wood fire, the seriousness of the prayers and songs and rituals, and the sense of community in the ceremony with the people who gather. It seems neither possible nor appropriate to attempt to report on the spiritual aspects of the rite. But the Great Spirit, by whatever name he is called, reportedly has promised, "He who seeks me shall surely find me." This is also from unpublished material, because I don't know who would publish it. It was the Southern Utes who invited me into their sweat lodge for a purification rite. The sweat lodge is constructed of boughs and skins, low, with a pit in the center. Stones that had been heating for hours in an open fire were lowered into that pit. And when the lodge was sealed, water was poured over those hot stones. The heat was unbearable, and I felt as if I were being parboiled. I, who do not perspire easily, soaked both the swimming suit and the robe I had over it. Each participant had been given a handful of wild sage to breathe through when the heat became too much. By the time I left the lodge, my sage looked as if it had been pureed. A Navajo woman took a baby into the lodge with her and nursed him throughout the rite to keep the child from dehydrating. Sometime during the fourth segment of the rite, I had lost so much potassium that my body could no longer hold itself up. The young brave sitting next to me took a hold of my wrist in the darkness and whispered, "Do you need help?" "No," I whispered back, because I was skirting the edge of an ion-changing high that vision seekers strive for, and I didn't want to miss a thing. The songs, chants, and prayers were deeply spiritual. At the close of the rite, I crawled out of the lodge and lay face down on the earth, unable to do anything more. Several others prostrated themselves beside me as a show of friendship and support. A feast of watermelon and stew was restorative, and the holy man, Eddie Box, said to me, "Face the rising sun each morning and ask the Great Spirit to enter you so that he shine forth from you as you go about your work each day. If you will do that, all your needs will be met. You will have to ask for nothing more." Our old people knew that so well and practiced it, but the young do not believe. It was shortly after that I was on my porch early one morning, facing the rising sun with my palms up on the porch rail. Suddenly I was startled to feel a hummingbird land in my hand. Thinking the small wild creature would only do such a thing if it were close to death, I closed my other hand around it, making it a cozy cocoon in which to die. After several minutes, I opened my hand, and the bird darted off as full of life as anything. I think of it as a very special moment, and to have such a visit by such a wild bird surely must have deep symbolic meaning. When a young warrior of that same tribe was taken into the Gourd Society, I was invited to the powwow that followed. I have eaten lots of corn soup and fry bread. I have danced the bear dance. I have gotten up in the early hours to be present for that high holy moment of sunrise on the last day of the Sundance, where I was brushed in blessing with the holy eagle wing. But the peyote rite in the Native American church remains the peak of my experience with Indians. Peyote is bitter and bad tasting, and the little towels the worshipers have draped over their arms are not ceremonial, but for retching. The all-night peyote rite starts at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and I am the only white woman among the 40 persons who have gathered to thank God for sending them a Savior. I've never ingested peyote before, and am surprised that it neither makes me sick nor do I hallucinate. The temperature fluctuates inside this hogan, where I sit cross-legged on the dirt floor all night, and I can't tell if the smoke from the sheep herder's stove keeps me awake or makes me sleepy. Peyote is passed 3 different times during this night to all participants as crushed buds and in water to form a sort of tea. The sacred drum is passed around the circle to pairs of males, one of whom drums while the other chants. The doorkeeper keeps the fire going in the stove and removes the coals regularly to keep the crescent-shaped altar before the priest aglow. At 3:30 a.m., very tired and weary of the constant drumming and chanting, I leave the hogan. The hostess of the event follows me out. "You do not leave the middle of a religious ceremony," she admonishes me. I am very stiff from sitting cross-legged all those hours, but I go back and am very glad I did. At sunup, a young woman of the tribe who had given birth 10 days earlier brings her baby tied to a cradle board into the hogan seeking a blessing. It is Christmas morning now and entirely right for the arrival of an infant. But the air is heavy with suspense, for this young mother's father has not spoken to her since he learned she was pregnant, because she is not married, and he is the priest. He hesitates with a whole range of emotions playing across his serious face. Then he picks up the holy eagle wing and brushes both mother and child in blessing, his daughter with tears streaming down her cheeks, and his first grandchild. At the end of the rite, the fast is broken with the 4 staples of life: corn, berries, bread, and venison. But the high moment for me is still ahead. That hostess who scolded me a few hours earlier motions the priest to her. She removes from her finger an old and beautiful turquoise and silver ring, gives it to him, and he takes it to the altar where he pronounces a blessing on it. To my surprise, he then brings it to me, places it on my finger, while the old woman says, "On this Christmas I give you my ring, for throughout this night we have become sisters." After I got back from Niobrara last summer, I did a commentary for Nebraska Public Radio about my experience there that didn't fit into the newspaper. And I called it Old Cemeteries. I have always loved old cemeteries, and now I know why. First of all, the resting place of the dead lays life's little feverishness to rest. And secondly, cemeteries jumpstart my story-making machinery. On Friday night, I climbed a hill a few miles west of Niobrara to visit the ancestral resting place of the Poncas. From the powwow grounds below, I could hear the recorded drum music and knew of the bustle of feast planning, ritual planning, and the undercover political posturing that was going on. The southern and northern Poncas were celebrating a reunion of a fracture that was forced on them 117 years ago. It was a big event and a lot of hassle of food preparation, portable sanitary systems, and electric sound systems. A cemetery makes the statement that none of the above matters greatly. In 100 years, whatever obsession has us in its clutches now will be gone like the wind. The Poncas are prone to say, and I heard it more than once this past weekend, only 3 or 4 of us know where Standing Bear is buried, but we are not telling because we do not want his remains disturbed. I feel certain from this high spot Standing Bear's grave is within my range of vision. But I'm not into remains. Storytelling is my game. And I know Standing Bear's story. I know his testimony in U.S. District Court 115 years ago when he said, "Your hand is not the color of my hand, but the same God made us all." One of the reasons I have made this climb is because Gilbert Cole pointed out this burial ground and said that his grandparents are buried here, between 2 red cedars. The graves are not marked, and now the trees are dying, and I will not be able to find them. My hand is not the color of Cole's hand. My hair seems extraordinarily white here among these Native Americans. I am a guest, and they need not hear my opinion about anything. But if I could speak my truth to Cole, I would say, you will be able to find your grandparents in the new seedlings growing here. You will find them in the morning mist that clings to the Niobrara River. My thoughts are interrupted by a change in the music coming from far below. The recorded drums have been replaced by guitar, a call to feast. I start back down the hill with a beautiful orange and black butterfly flitting down the path ahead of me. Mr. Cole, I would say if I could, do you have grandchildren? Haven't you seen your grandparents in their eyes and smiles? How do I know? Well, the monarch butterfly told me. If there are people who want to write, there's only one way to do it, and that's to write. If you sit and think, well, I'm going to wait for inspiration to strike me, it's never going to come. You go and you write every day, and you don't write for an audience. You write to satisfy yourself. And pretty soon it will occur to you that what you have said needs to get out of your writing room somewhere else. And in the beginning, several times I would just give stories away. And through my whole writing life, I've given ideas away because that's how you keep the flow going. And my coworkers at the Journal and Star used to say to me, how can you afford to give your ideas away? And I said, I can't afford not to, because it isn't something you can save. It's just a flow. So now I'm writing historical stuff. About a year ago, I was writing a book that is called A Dangerous Class, and it's the history of the suffrage movement in Nebraska. Nebraska was sort of critical to the national movement, and then this suffrage movement became the League of Women Voters, and so then the last part of the book is about the League, and it is just now off the press. I still have one goal that's just, it's the only thing that I've ever started that I haven't been able to write, and that is I want to do a novel about rural electrification coming to the plains. Because when I was a child, it was in the church, it was in the school, it was in our home, it was a hot political item. And come on in. And I think nobody's ever told the story. And I would really like to tell the story. And I've got 110 pages written. And unfortunately, it already has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it reads exactly like a news story. And what I can't do is, you know, I have to say what your gestures were and how you were dressed. And see, that's all the stuff that gets cut out of newspaper writing. And so I just can't, I cannot finish this story, or I haven't been able to yet, but I want to very much, because that one issue, that social political issue of bringing electricity to rural America, oh, that's a real story. Well, now everybody who's listening to this will go out and write it, won't they?